The topic for this week's blog is how to pick up stitches along a curved edge, much like you would find on a neckline. And a curved edge is made up of bind-off stitches and a vertical edge. In this case, it's slanted because of these decreases. And the problem that people have when they pick up stitches along a curved edge is that they see these holes at where the stair steps are, and they believe that that is where they should be picking up stitches. And anytime you insert a needle into a hole, you make it bigger. So you want to avoid that. What you want to do is pick up a stitch in every column of stitches, and this is important. So it's important to know what a stitch looks like. A stitch looks like a V that is open at the bottom. So here's a stitch, here's a stitch, here's a stitch, here's a stitch. Then we jump all the way up here. Here's a stitch, here's a stitch, here's a stitch. And then we get to our vertical edge, which we discussed, I think, in the last tip, how to pick up stitches on vertical stitches. Now, if I were to pick up a stitch there, it would just make that hole even bigger. But if I jump over that stitch and pick up a stitch here and here, that will close up that hole. And then I use whatever ratio it is on my vertical stitch. See last week's tip for a refresher. Now, if you pick up a stitch in the space between the column of stitches, what it does is it's going to press together those stitches so that they look like those dread 11s. We saw that in when you pick up stitches on a horizontal edge. The thing that complicates it is when you jump up from here to here. But when you get it done, it miraculously closes up those holes. Now, to pick up a stitch, you do the same thing that you do to pick up any stitch on a horizontal edge. And I'm just going to put my needle in this first thing, this in the selvage that sort of looks like a stitch. Pull that up. And actually, it might look a little better if I did it there. Yeah, provide a bit more support, but still it is in the stitch below. I'm going to pick up a stitch here. And again, I'm using gigantic needles so that you can see the stitches. And I'm going to pick up the stitch here. Now, you can see that the stitch that I've picked up in blue is coming directly out of the stitch in the row below the bind off. That is where you should be picking up these stitches. I'm going to pick up a stitch here, and then this is where I'm going to jump up to the next row. Now, if I were to pick up a stitch here, it would be ugly, it would be between columns of stitches, and it would make that hole even larger. So instead, I'm going to find my next column of stitches. Here's my column of stitches, here's my next column of stitches, and I want to move up to the stitch below the bind off, which is there, and then the next column of stitches, the next column of stitches, and then I'm at my vertical edge. So if I were to pick it up here, I'm going to have a great big old ugly stitch. It's going to leave a hole. So instead, I'm going to move it here. And then so on. Whatever ratio I had determined for that vertical edge is what I would pick up. Now, when you pick up stitches, before you get too far away, just make sure that you don't have any in the spaces between stitches. Here's a column of stitches, that's my selvage. Here's a column, 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 and then here's where we go into the vertical edge. Now, if you have trouble seeing those column of stitches, you might want to look back at some of my earlier postings about how to read your work, particularly how to read stockinette stitch, because you're not going to be able to pick up edges if you can't read your work. Well, you can pick them up, they just won't look very good.